Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final panel discussion of the conference today. If you just bear with me a minute and I will invite our chair and speakers onto the stage.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last panel of our Four Nations conference. Hannah is just welcoming our speakers into the stage. So bear with us for 1 minute or so while we get them onto the panel. So we're still waiting for one other speaker, but I'll start the introductions and housekeeping right now. So my name is Sara. I'm head of research and policy at the UK Women's Budget Group, and it's a pleasure to welcome our speakers to the conference and to the last panel of these 2 brilliant days that we've had, which have been filled with very interesting conversations around how to make sure that we deliver a caring economy and gender budgeting in practice in the 4 nations across the UK. So yesterday we heard from Sarah Veal on the findings of the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, and also the recommendations to create an economy that puts care and people at the center. And now, following on from this work of the Commission, we at the UK Women's Budget Group are currently collaborating with WEN, the Women's Environmental Network, on a feminist Green New Deal to promote dialogue between the women's movement and the environmental movement to ensure that plans to decarbonize the economy don't treat women as an afterthought, and that gender equality and social justice are also central goals in Build Back Better plans. So we have a public event as part of this Feminist Green New Deal project, which is going to focus on transport, so how to rethink transport to be sustainable and inclusive of the needs of women, as well as sustainable for the planet. So with this short plug done, I'll now turn the focus on to our session today. So we have a brilliant session to close our 4 Nations conference. We will hear from speakers from each of the 4 nations of the UK, who will talk about the efforts and initiatives to ensure that the recovery puts people and planet at the center, and so how we can work together towards a green, caring economy. So I will introduce our speakers individually as they are called onto the panel in a moment, but just to talk about the structure, each speaker will talk for 7 minutes, so we can have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will then, and you can also vote on other people's questions. And then at the end, depending on the amount of time that we have, I will choose a few to ask our panel. So we are going to hear first from Zarina Ahmad, who has been working in the environmental sector in Scotland for over 10 years, combining 2 areas of interest, equalities and climate change. Zarina is the founder of the Ethnic Minority Environmental Network, which is a platform for ethnic minority voices and a network for emerging climate leaders. Zarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sara. So I'll tell you a little bit about the work that I do, where the gaps are and what needs to be done, probably. So I'll start off with just my a little thought that came into my head, because on the round table we had a quick discussion, and one of the things that came up was somebody asked me the question, "Are you an economist?" And I said no. And that always goes back to when somebody asked me, "Are you an activist?" And I said no, right? Because I don't see myself as an activist. I don't see myself as a political activist, and I certainly don't see myself as an economist. But this is where I suppose the issue lies, because the other lady around the table, Sue, she actually turned around and said, "Well, we all are economists. And in a way, we're all political activists as well." And it's probably valuing that and understanding that I feel is missing, right, in the work that I do with women. So a little bit about the work that I do. So like Sara said, I've been working with diverse communities on climate change. In Scotland, we are fortunate. We've had the Climate Challenge Fund, which allows communities to take action on climate change. However, when this fund was first rolled out, there was very little diversity in people that were applying, the organisations that were applying, people that were working within the sector. And that's how I came about to work with Scottish Government to ensure that the Climate Challenge Fund was reaching out to diverse communities. Now, at this time, there was a perception that ethnic minorities do not engage on climate change. They're not interested in climate change. Now, those words are like a red rag to a bull to me, so it was a challenge. So since then, I'll put it into perspective, between 2008 and 2012, there were only 3 projects from the ethnic minority sector that had ever been funded through the Climate Challenge Fund. Since 2013, since I started working in partnership with Keep Scotland Beautiful, we've had now over 150 projects, small and large ones, funded through the Climate Challenge Fund. So it's been a huge turnaround and a landscape of groups that are engaging in climate change. Now, when I talk about climate change, the areas and the focus around like sustainability has been around energy efficiency, energy awareness, energy consumption, renewable energy. Then there's the other area of transport, looking at active transport, looking at car sharing, electric vehicles, cycling more. Food, so looking at where our food comes from, looking at the food system, looking at air miles, looking at local produce, and also looking at food waste, and low carbon food as well. And then the last one is around waste in general. So looking at setting up recycling projects, reusable, upcycling, and that can include like textiles, plastics, lots of different materials. So that's where the focus has been, right? And where the focus is missing has been on having that voice, that political voice, and that political agenda to say, well, what are the impacts on us as women, right? So so those discussions don't take place. Those discussions don't happen. And I'm hoping now that with the support of WEN and the Scottish Women's Budget Group, that we're going to be taking forward some more of this work to sit with women and have these discussions and have a better understanding of what it is that they want to see happening when we talk about a just transition. There's a lot of work in Scotland around a just transition. However, again, within that just transition, there isn't a feminist perspective. There isn't an acknowledgement that we have to have a better system that cares and values the work that women do. So for me, that's quite important that we carry on working. There's still a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of feminist groups within Scotland, but however, there's a lot of environmentalist groups. But what we don't have is we don't have the two together. We don't have a female-led environmental group or a female environmental movement in Scotland. And I'd like to see that happen so that we can take forward some of these important discussions, such as the Feminist Green New Deal in Scotland forward. What I have seen, though, that at the forefront of the work that gets done is women. It is women that lead on these projects. It's women that make the changes. It's women that make the differences. It's the women that have the passion and the compassion to make the changes. So, and it's also the women that are then unfortunately impacted, but then aren't in a position that they can actually make a difference at that political level. So that's what's happening in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zarina. That was really interesting. I think that definitely resonates with our experience as well, with the local data project that we talked about yesterday, about getting people to realize that they do have a voice, they do have expertise, and that that their voice should be heard, and that also in the context of the these discussions around climate change, it is often people will often think about these as very abstract, or they can be very abstract in terms of cuts to emissions, or something that is happening somewhere but not close to them. But it's about also making them realize the impact that these things are having and will have on their lives, and what their participation.
Can I just add something there, because just something that you've just touched on. So one of the reasons why I have been successful with the projects that I've worked with was because the groups I work with have connections to other parts of the world. So climate change wasn't abstract. It wasn't about carbon emissions. It wasn't about reaching net zero. It was about the impacts on their family, their home lives. And that's what made the job that I do so much easier. And so that was one of the reasons why it was easy, because of the connection, the global connection. And the second thing, it was religion, right? So religion, so even though we live in the UK and it's very secular in the UK, but around the world, there are many, many communities, many people of faith, and faith has an important leadership role. And faith and religion is a really important discussion when we talk about feminism and feminist Green New Deal. So that's a whole new topic that we can talk about as well.
Thank you, Zarina. That's very interesting. So now we're going to move on to the next speaker. So I'm going to invite Roshini Thamotheram to speak next. So Roshini is a campaigns project coordinator at the Women's Environmental Network. She's an educator and activist with marginalized groups, and she's part of the Feminist Green New Deal project collaboration between WEN and the UK Women's Budget Group, where she delivers grassroots training across the UK. Roshini, over to you.
Super, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about WEN's role in the Partnership for Feminist Green New Deal. But just to introduce WEN, it's the Women's Environmental Network, which is a charity based in London, and it's been working for gender and climate justice for over 30 years, essentially by bringing a gendered lens to environmental discussions and working to connect gender with health, equality and the environment. And all of our work aims to bridge this divide. And yeah, today I'm going to speak about the Feminist Green New Deal project, which is one of the projects that we do there at WEN. We've partnered up, as Sarah said, with the Women's Budget Group to mobilise broad support for a Feminist Green New Deal in the UK. And this is building on the work of the Women's Environmental and Development Organisation, We Do. And WEN and Women's Budget Group will be working together to strengthen the relationship between grassroots and policy. So a part of WEN's role in this project is leading on the grassroots workshop programme, and we are connecting with women's organisations across the UK to deliver a series of participatory grassroots workshops, working in a sort of partnership model with women's groups. We're in the early process of this, and we are learning lots as we go. So far, we've done a trial workshop with Bournemouth Uni, and I've done 3 of the real workshops. One with an African women's group in Oldham called SORN, Support for African Women's Network, an Asian women's group in Birmingham called CET, Communities Engage and Thrive, and a queer women's group in Northern Ireland called Here and I. And the aim is to reach out and hear from lots of different people. So not just focusing on gender, but with a particular focus on marginalised voices. And we have a workshop in June with Sisters of Frida, which is an experimental collective of disabled women. So we've got this like one workshop that we take out to these very different groups of women. And so there's a lot of different groups of people. There's a lot of reflection that needs to happen, because although there's commonalities amongst the groups, there's a lot of tailoring to and being sort of reflexive in order to get the best use of the women's time. So the reason for these workshops, and this being a part of the project, is to gain input from the women in the group, the contributors, about what their priorities are and what an inclusive and intersectional feminist Green New Deal should prioritise. As one of the contributors said, they don't need people over there to talk for them. They need people to come and talk to them. This input is then fed back and taken through the roundtable discussion paper route to policy. And we are working in this process to amplify voices that are actively marginalised and racialised and often not heard. And we need to start seeing these experiences reflected at policy level. That's why this whole project has started. And that's what policy should really be about, right? It needs to be grounded in everyday lives. So a really exciting piece of work that we're doing, we'll be hosting a series of Feminist Green New Deal events at COP26 in person, pandemic allowing, working with national and global partners to build momentum for a Feminist Green New Deal that can help shape the national and international response to the climate emergency. We will launch our Feminist Green New Deal manifesto at COP, which will be informed by the recommendations arising from the grassroots workshops. The grassroots level participation is something that we hope to build on by involving the contributors in COP26. We'll be there under the Women and Gender Constituency Pavilion at COP. And we're hoping that some of the women will be from the grassroots, from the workshops, from the women's organisations that we're connecting with, will be able to come in person and join us and exhibit things that are there and be a part of the conversation at the time in November, COVID allowing. These women have been given often so little opportunity to voice issues that so many things in this kind of in this dynamic, right? Not in their home life, not in their families, not in their communities, but to have those voices heard by anything that can go into policy. And so when being invited to voice ideas and concerns, there are so many things that come out when you're talking about what's a green, safe, fair future mean for you. And so a challenge of this process, I need to check time because I forgot to check. Am I okay for time? I feel like I'm going.
Yes, you still have 4 minutes or so.
Oh, right. Okay, I'll slow down. A challenge of this process is wanting to and needing to respect people's time and contributions. And we've got some like incentives to join. So, because it would be quite ironic if we were talking about paid, unpaid labour and unpaid care work, and then sort of hoping that people would just come and volunteer their time in order to feed in. So we have, as part of the funding, got monies to reimburse people for their time, not so much in like an hourly wage, but in a sort of a gift, a token for their time. And so, yeah, I was saying the challenge of the process is wanting and needing to respect the time of the contributors, but also acknowledging in this time and keeping it limited that we don't have the time to deep dive into detail. And also in relation to time, it's true to say that I'm sort of parachuting into the group. I'm not off the group. And so to build a rapport and trust is time restricted. So to overcome this, I'm working with women's groups who have already got relationships and confidence and trust within the group. And I'm going to where they are and approaching it knowing full well that they're the experts and I'm there to listen. Yeah, some of the other challenges are sort of moving the discussion away from the individual to policy asks, because this feminization of environmental labor, so for example, the individual recycling and the sort of, you know, it's my fault if the world is going to die sort of framing that's gone into the climate sort of discussions on different levels. That's realizing that that's got a gender angle, and working it and trying to discover how to get away from that and how to shift the sort of overall framing, because there's a challenge in reimagining on a systemic level. Sorry, because how often are any of us asked to think of things on a systemic level rather than our day to day? This is the challenge, that with each workshop, we're reflecting, evaluating, and evolving the workshops. And the women who do the workshops are really shaping the workshop for the women that come after them, because we spend a time towards the end to reflect and talk about what worked and what didn't. Yeah, a few more points. A strength of these workshops is that we are approaching it as a participant-led process, and that involves reframing and refining the workshops after each one. More on the successes then, and less of the challenges. So we have made engaging on climate issues for women's organisations possible by using accessible language, and also again like being led by the group coordinator or members of the group. So for instance, we were told that don't use feminist Green New Deal, but talk about health, body, and food, and frame it from that sort of angle to engage our group. And again, just really emphasizing that the success is about adapting these workshops to make them more inclusive. One example of this is it's an online process at the minute, and we hope that it will go into person. But so not assuming that everybody's got a laptop, so making it accessible if you're accessing on a phone. And so for some of them we use Google Slides, for others we use Mentimeter, and for others we just use the chat box function. We're also gonna be aware that when we're doing the Eventbrite, we're asking for people's access needs. So if we're gonna need British Sign Language, if we're going to need captioning, then there are things that we can put in place for the workshop to be inclusive for all members. I feel like that's probably enough. Is that, yeah, that's probably 7 minutes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Roshini. That was really good. Just to add to what Roshini was mentioning, so the WEN is leading on these grassroots workshops across the UK, and in parallel, the UK Women's Budget Group is organizing these policy roundtables that are bringing together the women's movement and the wider social justice movement together with the environmental movement to have these conversations about specific policy areas. And what we're hoping is that, and what we're working towards is that the findings from these grassroots workshops are feeding into these policy discussions to make sure that these voices are taken into account. So next we have Sophie Howe. So Sophie was appointed in 2016 as the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Her role is to act as a guardian for the interests of future generations in Wales, and to support the public bodies listed in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015 to work towards achieving the wellbeing goals. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be with you this afternoon. Always an absolute pleasure to be with a group of brilliant feminists. You might see my necklace here, which is this is chopsy, which is a Welsh word for feisty, or I was told that the Jamaican word was feisty. So there we are. So great to join a group of chopsy or feisty women. So as you heard, my role is as Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. Wales is the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which does a number of things. First of all, it sets out this requirement for all 44 of our main public institutions in Wales, so all of our local authorities, our health boards, our national organisations like Natural Resources Wales, Public Health Wales and so on, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how they're taking decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 national wellbeing goals. So these are set out in law. They can't change from one, political cycle to the next. You wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals, but it is. We're the only country that does have those long-term goals set out in statute. They are linked back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they cover things like a more equal Wales, a healthier Wales, a prosperous Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, globally responsible Wales, and a resilient Wales. And then the Act sets out what we call 5 ways of working. So these are kind of, I suppose that if every public body and if every policymaker and decision taker adopted these 5 principles, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in on very many fronts at the moment, in terms of climate crisis, in terms of preparedness for things like pandemics, in terms of preparedness for things like the ageing population. So requirements to plan for the long term, recognising the long-term impact of the decisions that we take, or sometimes actually the decisions that we don't take, preventing problems from occurring or getting worse, integrating your work, so recognising that everything's kind of connected to everything, and I'll come back to that in a moment, involving citizens in decision making and collaborating across the public, private, third sector, and so on. So those are the principles by which all of our public sector have to work in Wales. So what difference is this making, and why are those principles so important? Well, of course, we're in the middle of an emergency at the moment, a global pandemic, but we have another huge, existential crisis and threat coming down the track towards us. That is climate change, and of course, we're seeing that across the world. People are, politicians are seeing that kind of, building back better as being rebuilding with a green recovery. I don't subscribe to the concept of building back better, because that suggests that what we had before was okay and we just need to do it a bit better. I don't think that we need to do the same things better. I think that we need to do fundamentally better things, because when you see the wealth of the world, or the large proportions of the wealth of the world concentrated in the hands of about 60 odd people, hold the same amount of wealth as about the 3.6 billion poorest people, that says to me that there is something fundamentally wrong with our system, and making that a bit better is not enough at all. We actually need to be sort of challenging the system, or the symptoms of the system, whilst changing the system itself. But, it is promising that we are seeing this focus on, well, in Wales, the government's policy is around a prosperous, green and equal recovery. So there's nothing to disagree with there. The problem is that often those just become sound bites that everyone kind of gets behind. But when you scratch beneath the surface of that, as I am doing in my role as Future Generations Commissioner, so part of my job is to, call out the nonsense, if you like, and expose some of these problems and challenges for future generations. If you scratch beneath the surface, what we will see is that by investing in a green in a green recovery, so putting our investment into things which are sensible from a carbon emissions perspective, like retrofitting energy efficiency, new boilers in homes, like installing electric vehicle infrastructure, like engineering and so on for public transport provision. All of that is sensible from a climate change perspective, but currently the vast majority of jobs in those areas are male jobs. So in technical engineering, for example, only 2% of apprenticeships are women. So by investing, unless there is some rapid action now in terms of diversifying and increasing that skills pipeline, investing in a green recovery could actually exacerbate gender inequality. And so we need to think about this differently. We do need to recognise the connections between gender and the environment. So the fact that globally, the people who live beneath the poverty line, 70% of those people are women. And if you live beneath the poverty line, if you're living in poverty here in the UK, you're also more likely to be living in areas of high air pollution. You're also less likely to have access to public space and access to nature. And if we follow that track in terms of investment in those kind of green industries and areas, you're also less likely to be able to access one of the new green jobs that are being created. So I think that we need to have some urgent action in terms of the skills pipeline in those areas, but we also need to be investing in a care-led recovery, and we need to be seeing that care-led recovery as part of a green recovery, because for the same level of investment in terms of investing in construction, for example, investing in a care-led recovery creates about 30% less carbon emissions. So we might not be thinking about, or politicians might not be thinking about care as part of the green recovery, but absolutely they should be thinking about care as part of the green recovery. If we invest in increasing the amount of care jobs, so in Sweden and Denmark, about 10% of the whole employed population are employed in care, and make those jobs better paid and better valued, invest in those areas could make a really significant return on investment and return to local economies as well. So that's where I sense that everything really is connected to everything. But when we scratch beneath the surface of what government policy is often doing, those connections are not being made, which is why I think it's incumbent on us all to be really calling out, some of the detail. We can't just have this soundbite of a green and just and equal recovery without actually doing the hard yards to ensure that that happens. And then the final point that I want to make is just around that kind of long-term planning as well, because as we emerge from this crisis, and as I said, it's promising that there is this focus on the next crisis around climate change and so on. But we also need to be thinking broader than that. So we have an ageing population, double the number of over 65s by 2036, and we have a massive gap in terms of the caring workforce, and we have massive gaps in terms of, so 56% of people in the caring workforce in Wales are paid below the living wage. So we've got some huge challenges there. So this kind of long-term planning and long-term approach is absolutely essential if we are going to prevent inequality being widened, because as the ageing population grows, what will happen, we all know what will happen, is the sandwich generation will grow, and the sandwich generation are women who will be having to give up work to meet caring responsibilities towards children and older relatives or neighbours and so on. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we rebuild post-COVID in a way which is going to stave off both the environmental crisis which is coming our way and that potential crisis in care. And we need to be thinking about some of those long-term issues and really trying to understand what the implications might be of the new world that we find ourselves in now. So on the one hand, everyone's sort of in the shift to working from home could be a game changer, or, you know, I think is a game changer to a certain extent for people with caring responsibilities, majority of whom, as we know, are women. But how do we ensure that we're not creating a two-tier workforce where the men go back to the office and the women with the caring responsibilities are the unseen working from home? What are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about now to try to ensure that those things are you know, don't become a reality and there aren't unintended consequences? So that's where I think that the framework that we've got through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales provides a useful framework, certainly for us in Wales and potentially for other countries. I was really pleased to see that the SNP have in their manifesto a commitment to have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, so go Scotland. And there's also a private members bill which is going through. Lord John Bird, the founder of the Big Issue, has just been successful in the ballot to take a Future Generations Act for the UK through Parliament. So I think it's needed now more than ever, and I think that connection and that interconnection between different aspects of equality and that long-term planning is absolutely crucial if we're going to prevent a next generation of women facing inequalities in the same or potentially even worse ways.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for those really, really good points to which we subscribe. Definitely reiterating the point that plans to decarbonize the economy don't necessarily mean that they will translate into a more just society and economy. So there needs to be a conscious effort to make that happen. So I think that's really the point of that we want to make with our Feminist Green New Deal project. And absolutely, care should be seen as a core part of any green recovery for all the points that you mentioned. So now we're going to hear from Siobhán. So Siobhán Harding is a research and policy officer at the Women's Support Network, which is a feminist organization that provides support and services to women's centres and groups in Northern Ireland. Siobhán is also a member of the Women's Policy Group and the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. So Siobhán, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon and happy World Bee Day, everyone, from a very wet and windy Belfast. As Sarah said, I'm Siobhán and I work for the Women's Support Network here in Northern Ireland. I just wanted to start by providing a bit of context around Northern Ireland. So we have a very large rural population here and farming is our biggest industry. So we have around 25,000 farms here, most of which are small and family run. And we have a very patriarchal society, which is based on the passing on of land through generations. So farming is vital for our local economy, employing more than 3.5% of the total workforce compared to the UK average of 1.2%. So there's a very strong farming lobby here. Our new decade, new approach, January 2020 agreement to restore local government here after a 3-year hiatus has committed to tackling climate change and to introduce legislation and targets for reducing carbon emissions. Ironically, the fall of the Assembly here was triggered by the Renewable Heat Incentive scandal, or the Cash for Ash scandal. So we have, unfortunately, a poor record of performance on climate issues, as well as in many areas of policy and legislation in relation to women. The largest sector here in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is agriculture, not surprisingly, which represents around 27% of emissions, with transport at 23% and energy supply at 15%. We accounted for 4% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, which is slightly higher than our population share of 3%. and our emissions are not falling at anywhere near the same rate as those in the UK. We reduced emissions by 20% between the base year and 2018, compared to 46% in England, 45% in Scotland, and 31% in Wales. And we are the only part of the UK and Ireland with no legally binding greenhouse gas reduction targets. But despite our poor performance around all of this, the level of public concern on environmental issues is very high. In 2020-21, 82% of households here were very or fairly concerned about the environment. So we've only recently started to work on climate change legislation here. Last year, there was a motion to the Assembly to acknowledge the climate emergency and work to develop a climate change bill within 100 days. So a group of legal experts, scientists, academics and environmentalists presented draft legislation for consideration, and it has been taken forward as a private member's bill by Green Party leader Claire Bailey, but all of the other parties, with the exception of the DUP, are co-sponsoring it. So the bill was introduced to the Assembly in March 2021 and is now at committee stage, with the overriding climate objective is the establishment in Northern Ireland of a net zero carbon, climate resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by the year 2045. It provides for the creation of climate action plans subject to the principles of just transition, and for the establishment of a Northern Ireland Climate Commissioner and Climate Office here. However, despite this progress, there is opposition to the bill. The bill is opposed by our Agriculture Minister, Edwin Poots, who was just last week voted leader of the DUP. It is opposed by the DUP as a party, the TEV and some farmers' groups. The Minister refuses to consider climate change as an emergency or a crisis. And during the debate, he said it was ludicrous to suggest that such legislation could be drafted in 3 months, and rejected the use of the terms emergency or crisis when it came to the climate change issue. And he also said his views were shared by officials in the Department of Agriculture who do not feel that this is appropriate language. He also said that a net zero by 2045 target would be extremely detrimental to our economy and have a negative impact on the agri-food sector, which has a big and powerful lobby here. Claire Bailey from the Green Party said there was nothing in the bill that threatened farming, and it wasn't climate action that was the risk, but government policy which supports intensification and hands power in the supply chain to processors and supermarkets. So in terms of our record here of involving women, unfortunately, that is also pretty poor, which has been evidenced by a lack of women's involvement in talks around Brexit and COVID recovery. So we very much treat women as an afterthought here in terms of any attempt to build back better. To give an example, the Emergency Leaders Group, which was set up to coordinate the joint government and sector response to the COVID crisis, the women's sector lobbyist Rachel Powell, who's chair of the Women's Policy Group, asked to be on this group, but was told no, which meant that there was no women's sector representation on this leadership group. So despite the pandemic having a disproportionate impact on women, there was no women's sector representation on this group. And this is very reflective of government attitudes in terms of recognising the impact on women. In response, the Women's Policy Group produced a comprehensive feminist recovery plan for Northern Ireland in July 2020. It sets out our recommendations for recovering from COVID across a range of areas, including climate justice. It's heavily focused on the need to treat care as part of our essential infrastructure and for care to be prioritised as a low emission and green sector. It prioritises a feminist green recovery, which takes a holistic approach to tackling climate change with social justice at its core. The Feminist Recovery Plan endorses the Women's Budget Group and Women's Environmental Network paper for the Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which looks at the feminist Green New Deal from an intersectional feminist perspective. And this is an approach the Women's Policy Group endorsed for Northern Ireland in relation to our economic recovery and the Northern Ireland Executive's aims for tackling climate change. So Sophie talked about the need for systemic change, and we agree. And to quote Friends of the Earth, who spoke at a Feminist Recovery Plan webinar, you can't just add women and stir. We need to address the inequalities built into the current systems and take a gendered lens to climate change solutions, and involve the voices of grassroots women who are so often impacted. Unfortunately, however, there has been very little development on the recommendations within the Feminist Recovery Plan 1 year on. Our economic recovery plan here didn't even mention childcare, and the Department of Agriculture response to the plan has been vague, to say the least. The Women's Policy Group response to the Agriculture Minister's climate change discussion document argued that we need robust legislation with ambitious targets given the existential threat of the climate emergency, and we stated our support for the Climate Change Private Members Bill rather than the Minister's proposals. We argue that the targets set by the bill should be based on the most up-to-date scientific evidence available rather than political opinion. And we've been pushing for the Climate Change Bill to recognise the care sector as a green sector, and for the cross-party bill to take into account the recommendations in the Feminist Recovery Plan, which call for care to be placed at the core of our economy, and for investment into care as a means of achieving the goals to tackle climate change. If these recommendations are incorporated into a climate change bill for Northern Ireland, we believe that this could make significant progress in tackling the climate emergency, recognising the essential nature of care and contributing towards gender equality. In taking this approach, a Northern Ireland climate change bill could be locally led and designed to meet the particular circumstances here. However, we do have concerns that any separate bill will slow down progress on these issues with the current mandate due to end in 2022. On that note, I'll finish, and I thank you all for listening.
Very much, Siobhán. Those are really good points as well. I was really struck also by your presentation of the context of Northern Ireland and how they are different from other parts of the country when it comes to cuts in emissions, all of that. So I think that really brings home the point that we need to be mindful of the composition of local economies, and the context. Local context is really important when we are trying to see how we can best advocate for a particular policy or a particular change, because the challenges and the kind of the roadblocks will be different depending on the context. So thank you very much, everyone. I think this was a really good panel. Now we're going to move on to some questions. So I see we have a couple in the chat. What I'm going to do is invite the people who have asked the questions to come on stage and ask them themselves if they wish to do so. I see one of them, the first one, might have been done anonymously. So if the person who asked that question wants to come on stage to ask it directly to the panelists, then please just drop your name in the chat, and my colleague Hannah can invite you onto the stage, the online stage. Let me check. Okay, no problem. So I'll just ask the question to our panelists. So, are you able to share any ideas that women have raised in the recent group discussions on the Feminist Green New Deal? Are there areas that were particularly surprising or have been particularly neglected? So I think this question is for Roshini, but also for Zarina, who has done a lot of work with grassroots engagement in Scotland as well. So Roshini, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. It was about what's come up out of the workshops. What are some of the findings?
Yes.
I think and Zarina said this at the beginning of her speech as well, it was about, like, you know, this idea that that people aren't interested, like when you get out of a policy room or a think tank, that people generally are interested in minoritized communities. And what's been really sort of strong is that every person that's come to the workshop has got fully formed opinions, 100 ideas of what can be done to make life better in the area, and yeah, this is one of the major things coming out of it. But then there's a variation between sort of like a digital carbon footprint, and so the workshops last for 2 hours, and within it, if you know, and it's something to also be reflecting on, but people, it can go in one way depending on who's in the workshop. So in one workshop, digital carbon footprint was mentioned, and that got all the women speaking about their children's and at school, and being told to do all of their homework online and being given iPads. So whereas digital poverty might be thought of as a thing to sort of like give everybody an iPad, they're actually not wanted, because they don't want children to be engaged on screens with blue light. That wasn't something that I was expecting to hear. I guess is yeah, maybe Zarina wants to add something more.
Yeah, so to add to that, there's a couple of areas that have come up again and again. One's about consumption, and about consumption, about trade, about where, you know, what we buy, how we buy it, what decisions we have on what we buy, advertising. So consumption's a big one, that comes up a lot. And then the second one is food culture, and it's about our food and our food systems. And again, it's about the choices that we have or the choices that we don't have, because it's always an assumption that we have choices, but in reality, do we have choices? And that comes up again and again, especially with marginalized groups, when we're talking about like things like food poverty, we're talking about culturally sensitive food from around the world, post-colonialism, the legacy of colonialism on our food systems and the food that we have in the UK. So there's lots and lots of layers and lots of issues that I think that we can still discuss within the Feminist Green New Deal. And the last one is education, the role of education. What role does our education system have in discussing, encouraging, and acknowledging the feminist issues? And again, that's missing. And again, that comes up a lot in the workshops that I do.
Very much, Zarina and Roshini. I think those are really good points, particularly the issues around consumption. I think those can very well be gendered issues, because I think I can't remember who made the point about this move into the individualized responsibility for you know, for fighting against climate change, and how that can become a burden on women in particular, because we know that women are the ones who tend to absorb any extra unpaid work that may result from such efforts. So if we are moving away to a more, you know, home cooked meals, all of that, well, then who will be taking that on in our communities? And so that's a really important gendered point to make. So if you have any more questions, this for participants, if you have any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We have still a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, before we wrap up the conference. So after this panel, there will be half an hour where we will be back on conversational mode. So we will be back into the online tables where people can continue the conversation if they wish. So there was another question actually, which was about how can groups apply to host a workshop on the Feminist Green New Deal? So this will be specifically for Roshini. And I think, I mean, Roshini can answer now, but if Charlie is able to stick around, you can address Roshini after the when we go back to the conversational mode and exchange any details and all that. But I will let Roshini answer that briefly. Roshini, do you want to say a little bit about how you can be contacted?
Yeah, I think Anna's been popping the link in
right.
onto our webpage, but I've also just put my email address in there. And we don't have so many workshops in Wales, so if anybody can link us with Wales groups of women, that would be wonderful. Yeah, so I've put my email, it's just roshini@wen.org.uk, and you can contact us, and we would love to arrange some more workshops. That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Roshini. Okay, so if there are no other questions, then what I suggest is that we wrap up. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this panel, and please join me in giving a very warm thank you to our panelists today for a really good discussion and interesting presentations. And now I'll hand over to Marianne, who is going to say a few closing remarks to close the conference.
Thank you very much. And that was another fabulous panel, really, really interesting, and really brought together many of the themes that we've been talking about yesterday and today. And thank you to everyone who's taken part in the conference, to our sister organisations, the Scottish Women's Budget Group, the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, and the Welsh Women's Budget Group for helping organise the event with us, and to Hannah and Anna, who have organised the conference, and Hannah, who's been running the tech today absolutely brilliantly. This was the first time we used this software, so it was a little bit nerve-wracking before we started, but I think it's been really worth it. What we're going to do now is we're going to, one of the things I don't like about Zoom events is when they finish, they just vanish, and it vanishes off your screen and all the speakers vanish and everybody's gone. We're going to move into conversation mode, so it'll be a bit more like a normal conference. Now, if you have to leave, that's absolutely fine, just leave. But if you want to stay around, we've got the space for another half an hour, so we'll be in conversation mode. You can talk to anybody who's still here. If any of the speakers are still around, you'll be able to see on the participants list in the chat who's here. Get in touch with them, see if you can, send them a message, see if you can meet them on one of the tables. For those people who've just joined for this session and don't know how the conversation mode works, you'll find yourself on one of a series of tables, and you can move from table to table by double clicking on a different table. You have to have your camera and mic on for people on that table to be able to see you. And if they switch their camera and mic on, you can talk in the way you would around a normal small table at a conference. So I hope that some of you will stay with us for that conversation and to carry on these discussions. We'll be carrying on these discussions within the Four Nations project, and this particular discussion from this panel as part of the Feminist Green New Deal project. And we're very keen to hear from people who are interested in that project or any of the other projects that we've talked about over the course of today and yesterday. And I very much hope that you can be involved either in our work with the Women's Budget Group or with the work in one of our sister organisations, or indeed both. So thank you all very much for participating. It's been really great, and I look forward to seeing some of you when we move into conversation mode, which I think Hannah will do now. Thank you. Bye-bye.